to a lot of folks from other states and explained what it was that we were going to try to do here. And on more than one occasion, I had the response, the land-grant institutions are leading that effort in Florida. That would never happen in our state. So I want to just close this part of it to say thank you for your leadership and allowing us to do something a little crazy and have an opportunity to make something very unique come about. So thank you for your support to our land-grant institutions in Florida. We are, without further ado, going to move into our next part of the program, which is the keynote address. And to introduce our keynote speaker, I'm going to ask Dr. Mickey Swisher to come forward. And Mickey is a co-coordinator along with Dr. Cass Gardner from FAMU. And they are the coordinators for the state of Florida for the USDA Sustainable Ag Research and Education Program. Dr. Swisher.
Presenting John, because I think probably almost everybody in this room, if they do not know him directly, certainly is well aware of his work. So when I thought about that, I thought about how to introduce John, and as I sort of listened over the last day or so at this conference, I think John's story is a story that actually is, in essence, the story of many of us at this conference. So rather than introducing sort of John as an individual, I would like to introduce John as a sort of the story of American agriculture in many ways. John was born on a farm, worked on a farm as a child, as many of us did. He went away to college, as many of us did, and earned 3 degrees. He went on from there, as many of us did, to become a professional, what I call a non-farmer agricultural professional. We are the support professionals for farmers, right? He went on to do that and had a very distinguished career at land-grant institutions, where many of us work, or some of us have worked in the private sector, but gone on to our professional careers, right? And as he tells me, I did not know him then, but as many of us, sort of going about his job, doing his best, but perhaps not thinking really deeply about where is this whole thing headed, and where am I headed, and where are the people I work for headed. And I met John probably about 15 years ago. And like many of us, he became concerned about the sustainability of our food systems, the sustainability of our farms, and the sustainability of us who support them and of our institutions. And that certainly is the point at which John became one of the leading intellectual figures, I would argue, in sustainable agriculture, and particularly started to think very hard about small farms and where small farms fit in this picture. I have enormous respect for him because, as most of you know, it is hard in life to rethink what you have done and the contribution you have made and to move that forward in a progressive way. So I think we owe John an enormous debt of gratitude for making us all think. With that, John.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. And I'm really impressed with the turnout for this first Small Farm Alternative Agriculture Conference. And I know this is a great event for Florida, and I'm honored to be a small part of this great conference. I'm going to cover a lot of territory today. I'm going to cover about 100 years of history. So I want to tell you that I provided a paper that has all of the references and the websites and things of that nature, so you don't have to take notes. And I'm going to cover the ground pretty fast, but I want you to just kind of give you an impression of what I'm talking about. Because the title of the paper that I've provided that will be on the website is Farming in the Year 2050. I want you to take a trip with me today through time, and we're going forward for about 40 years or so to the year 2050, and looking back from that point. Now, it may help us a little bit when we're taking that trip if we look back, those of us who are old enough, about 40 years into the past, let's say back to the year 1970. Year 1970, the Vietnam War was still in full swing. And our new president, Richard Nixon, had just given the orders to go in and invade Cambodia. 1970, the civil rights movement was still in full swing. Martin Luther King Jr. had been killed about 2 years earlier, and Congress was in the process of putting together the civil rights legislation that would kind of shape things in the future. But there was still much work to be done to get even where we are today in terms of civil rights and equal opportunities. In the spring of 1970 was the first Earth Day, and that led to the passage of the bill that established, or the legislation that established the Environmental Protection Agency. But yet the environmental agenda was still ahead of us at that point in time. So it was a very different world back then. Now those of you that aren't old enough to remember 1970, just think back to when you were 10 years old and think about how much the world has changed since then. And I would argue today with the challenges that we're confronted with, the ecological, environmental challenges that are still there, the social challenges of the growing social inequity, and the economic challenges of an economy, a global economy that's on the brink of collapse, that the changes in the future will be even faster and more dramatic than have the changes in the past. And those people that are living in the year 2050 that can remember today will look back and realize that they are living in a fundamentally different world than the world that we're living in today. In the year 2050, the industrial economic development paradigm will be basically a relic of the past, because people within the early 2000s will have become aware, as many of us are today, that industrial economic model with its focus on our individual narrow self-interest quite simply was not sustainable. It took us to 2000 to realize that, because we didn't really address the environmental issues and the social justice issues when they came up in the 60s and the 70s. Because when we got into the 1980s, we began to realize that it cost money to clean up the environment and to put the cleaners on the smokestacks and to filter the pollutants out of the water. And that it decreases efficiency when you bring a whole segment of society into the workforce that's been deprived of an opportunity of the education to prepare themselves. And so in the face of the increase in cost, we retreated from reality, and we're suffering from 30 years of retreat and denial of the problems that we became aware of earlier in that century. But by the early 2000s then, again, looking back from 2050 today, we began to get ourselves and find ourselves not in Vietnam, but in two new wars on the other side of the world. And we survived the other crisis of the 1970s, but we were in another era of energy crisis, when the depletion of fossil energy wasn't just a peak in oil in this country, but a global peak in oil that we were looking at. And there was the growing realization that in using the fossil energy that was left, then we were doing things to the climate that caused the climate to become more volatile and uncertain and potentially threatened even the future of humanity on Earth. We hadn't addressed the social and economic inequity, and we were facing a wider gap between the wealthy and the rest of us that was wider than at any time since the Great Depression. But in fact, it was the second depression of the early 2000s that brought the country to the awareness that what we were doing, this industrial economic development with a narrow focus on individual self-interest, quite simply was not sustainable. And now in the year of 2050, we're just coming through and emerging from a transformation that virtually changed every aspect of human life on Earth. In 2050, we're still kind of dealing with the conflicts that emerged globally from the conflicts over and even the wars over the dwindling natural resources and energy that were left. The global confrontation and global war has been averted, but there's still the economic and social disparity that came out of those years of conflict will take generations to heal. But at least those